All right. Hello, everybody. I will ask Corey to cut the quirky music. But thank you for that, Corey. That was interesting. Welcome, everyone. I think we'll just give it another minute or so, another 30 seconds, and hopefully we'll get to 50 people in this meeting in the next 30 seconds, and we'll get started. All right. Well, according to my clock, it is 7 o'clock. So I think we're all ready to go. Welcome to the Edmonton River Valley Conservation Coalition's 5th night out on the North Saskatchewan. My name is Christine Kowalchuk. I'm the chair of ERVCC, and I'll be hosting tonight's event. I just want to see if others are seeing the slides still. I think we probably want to stop the slideshow. Excellent. There we go. All right. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the generosity and knowledge of Indigenous peoples who have cultivated relationships of respect, reciprocity, and care with this place and all its beings over millennia. Peoples including the Papaschase, Cree, Blackfoot, Dene, Nakota, Saulteaux, and Métis peoples. Today, all of us in and around Amisquatchie, Waskahegan, or Beaver Hills House, now known as Edmonton, are on Treaty 6 land. So those relationships are now the responsibility of all of us. The ERVCC understands that there's much to be learned from Indigenous ways of knowing about relationship with the land and each other, and we're committed to learning. ERVCC's goal in all the work we do is to listen to and honor the North Saskatchewan River, Saskatchewani CP in Cree, and its valley. The water from this river runs through all of us. We're all each 60% North Saskatchewan river water. This water also runs through the birch trees, the beavers, the sturgeon, the squirrels, and the chickadees. It connects us all. Since our founding in 2017, ERVCC has been working to honor the river and these beings through political advocacy, through events like River Valley Naps, and through knowledge sharing so that more and more people understand just how special this place is, and will stand up to ensure its proper care and protection. This year, we also started the ERVCC River Valley Fund, an endowment fund in partnership with the Edmonton and Area Land Trust through the Edmonton Community Foundation for River Valley Land Conservation. This conservation is deeply needed. While the City of Edmonton emphasizes the value of the River Valley and commits in many bylaws, plans, and policies to protecting and restoring it, the reality is that there's been a troubling trend of River Valley loss and degradation over the past decade. One of ERVCC's member organizations, CPAWS Northern Alberta, found that between 2000 and 2015, Edmonton lost approximately 75 acres of River Valley land each year. Since 2015, the losses have continued. The Valley Line LRT and E.L. Smith Solar Farm alone meant the loss of approximately another 175 acres. Furthermore, Edmonton has allowed infrastructure projects in use that obstruct or pinch the wildlife corridor and degrade habitat. And more such projects are planned, including major residential and commercial development in Rossville. Clearly, what we've been doing is not working. Sustainable planning requires not balancing human and environmental needs, but rather recognizing that humans are part of nature and that we must prioritize ecological relationships. Some, like my friend Dale Saddleback, also see these relationships as spiritual, and he talks often of sacred ecology. Our three speakers tonight all live and work in ways that are based on this understanding that humans are part of nature and that we must prioritize ecology or sacred ecology. These speakers are language instructor and native plant cookbook writer Sarah Delano, ecologist and city conservation planner Cathrine Shier, and Millcreek Ravine advocate Carolyn Nutter, three strong women from whom we have much to learn. Before I introduce our first speaker, however, I just want to cover a few practical details. First, we're recording this event, as probably all of you saw. Second, we've turned off everyone's mics and perhaps the public chat as well. But please type your questions for the speakers out for me. I guess, do we have a Q&A? I'm not sure if we have a Q&A section. If not, then just hold on to those questions for me. And then we're going to have a panel style Q&A at the end in which you can ask those questions. Please ensure you make clear to which speaker your question is directed. Between the second and third speaker, we'll take a few minutes for a live auction, and we're going to be auctioning off shovelfuls of native plants from the ever generous yard of the ever generous Rocky Furrow. For that period, we'll turn on everyone's mics in the chat and you can call out your bids. If you're going to call out the bid rather than put it into the chat, please say your name as well. And then after the third speaker, we'll move on to the Q&A. Lastly, this is our annual fundraiser. So while the event was free, we're grateful for your donations for basic operations like website hosting. Thank you so much to all of you who've donated already. If you haven't yet donated and would like to do so, you can send an e-transfer to ervccinfo@gmail.com. And finally, I'm honored to present our first speaker. Sarah Delano is a mother and language instructor. She's a member of the Métis Nation of Alberta and has ancestral ties to River Lot 28, one lot over from where the Kinnaird or Rat Creek Ravine sits, and very close to where she currently lives in the community of Parkdale. She harvests plants and berries in the ravine with her daughter and has recently completed a community-based research project and recipe book on diversity in green space and urban agriculture. As part of her studies, she also completed a report on Métis urban plant use with the Métis Nation of Alberta, with the goals of increasing the safety of urban harvesting for MNA citizens, as well as advocating for city policy that's more responsive to Métis plant harvesting rights. Sarah holds degrees in cultural studies and community engagement and currently teaches at the University of Alberta, MacEwan University, and the Multicultural Family Resource Society. Sarah will talk tonight about food and connection to land through food, which relates to her cookbook project. Over to you, Sarah, and welcome.
Great, thank you so much. Let me just see if I can bring this up successfully. Everyone can see, we're good to go? All right, great. So my name is Sarah. And first of all, thanks to the organizers who put so much work into these events. Thanks to all of you who are here to listen as well. And to the other speakers, I'm really excited to hear what you have to say tonight. So I'm going to be speaking to essentially cultural connections within the River Valley space and how we can connect to land and to the river through food and food systems. So I'm kind of speaking on behalf of myself and a group of women. We carried out a recipe project together. And I'm going to talk about this recipe book. And I thought kind of a good way to start would be to take a look at the land acknowledgement that comes from the book, both to acknowledge the land, but also because it gives a fairly succinct background to the project. And so I'm not sure that everyone is able to see the screen, read from the screen. So I'm just going to kind of read through most of this, which describes the book. It's about relationships to land and to each other through growing, foraging, and preparing local ingredients. Again, we're a group of immigrant women from many different parts of the world, and one Métis woman, that's me, who all live and harvest in the city of Edmonton. And we want to begin our story by acknowledging that we live on and are sustained by land located within Treaty 6 territory. This is the traditional land of many First Nations and Métis people, as well as a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples. And we understand gathering to include both that coming together and also the harvesting of plants for food. And both of those are kind of at the heart of our project. So the city of Edmonton currently has the second largest urban Indigenous population in Canada, as well as one of the highest immigration rates. But neither of those two communities are currently well represented in discussions relating to urban green space and food systems within the city. And that's sort of where our project comes from. So I'm not going to read through this whole thing, but essentially we hope that our recipes in our project encourage further reflection on land, food, and relationships within the city, past, present, and future. So I'll move on from that. And a little bit about myself and how I relate to kind of this space. I've always been very much connected to land through food and through kind of daily life processes. My mom is from Nova Scotia, and she's from a family of fishermen and also potato farmers. She's also from a family of 14, so they did a lot of foraging for food as they were many mouths to feed. They also planted based on moon cycles and did a lot of things that were passed down to me from my mom. And she does still supply me with potatoes from her acreage near Camrose. And then my dad grew up as an urban Métis person here in Edmonton. He does remember picking berries in the Millcreek Ravine space, and then he did a lot of harvesting, fishing and hunting with his father outside of the city. And he remembers harvesting berries and talking about berries with his grandmother, who was, her family is from Edmonton, but she grew up in the Fort Chip area. And so her family actually is connected to this family, the Fraser family. And when I moved to Edmonton, after growing up rurally, I became one of, I believe, 70% of Métis people who now live in urban centers. And I discovered that my house is actually quite close to this river lot where some of my ancestors lived. It's also the space where I go to harvest berries now. And it's a space where I do some teaching with my class. And that's sort of how the project came about. So you can see here, this is the Rat Creek. And this is, there's a nice trail here that goes all the way down to the river as well. And so this, oops, sorry. Let me find the connection to river lots for me was really important kind of from the beginning of the project, because it's a model from the past that we have of spaces that really connect food, culture, and community all within that river valley space. So there was trapping, there was foraging, there was farming happening. And then really importantly as well, the houses were quite close together. That was the model of this system. And so there were those kinship ties and that sharing of food and culture that happened. And I think that this is something that kind of gives us some insight into the potential of river valley spaces to be community spaces and to also be food spaces. And so I've also done some work with the Métis Nation of Alberta around foraging, present foraging within the river valley space. And so we worked on kind of different perspectives about why foraging is important and how it creates those kind of reciprocal relationships with the land. And those alternate perspectives of how we can steward the land and how we can be in relation with the land. So at the same time that I was doing that research with the Métis Nation, I had a day job. I have many day jobs. And one of them is teaching at the Multicultural Family Resource Society. And so I was teaching students. They were very interested in food. They were always cooking. I'm a terrible cook. So the good recipes in the recipe book that I'm going to show you come from them and not from me. And so we got into the river valley just to kind of see if there was any interest in being there and carrying out activities. And the one thing that people seemed really, really interested in was the harvesting of food. And of course, that was kind of the way that I connect to the river valley as well. And so we did a lot of harvesting. These are choke cherries here. And then the ladies really wanted to know, what can we do with these berries? And also had their own ideas about what to do with the berries. So the first thing that we did was make jam. And I'm going to show you this quick video because it was made by a student. And I think it's kind of telling. So very quickly here, you can get a glimpse into our process. All right, so you can kind of see what we did. It looks like I'm teaching the jam making, but actually in the background, my mother is there and did most of the teaching. But why I'm showing you this is because it wasn't actually a project that I had asked my students to do, but rather on their own. They took a ton of pictures of the process. and then made this video and wanted to kind of share that story. And so that sort of stuck with me, and I thought, oh, there's kind of a lot to talk about here. And at the same time, I was going through kind of a existential midlife crisis, so I went back to school to study community engagement. And I thought this would be a really interesting community-based research project. And so we started to look at our trips to the ravine as both food harvesting and kind of community gathering, but also as reflection and kind of looking at the spaces and how we relate to them and what we think about them and what makes us feel comfortable and uncomfortable and so on. And so this is the Rat Creek Ravine space. We can also see here, there's a community art project, which is another sort of intersection of green space and community building. And so what we decided to use for our research kind of method and methodology was the cookbook itself. And that was for many reasons. First of all, because that's what we were comfortable with as a group. Again, I'm not a great cook, but most of my students were quite accomplished in the kitchen. And we did use a kitchen space in the community center that we worked out of. And then the other reason that we used it is because this was a community-based project, and we really felt that focusing in on lived experience and using those types of research that kind of resonated with the values that we held and the values we were trying to put forward with the project. We really thought that that was a kind of a good way for us to work through the research project. And then we also kind of use this as a type of genre that questions this superiority of professional work or academic work to domestic work and traditional and intergenerational knowledge. And we have a shout out to Christine here, who wrote a really interesting book about recipes, which we'll have to talk about another time. And so there were a lot of reasons for us to use this genre, and especially because it was familiar to us, and the space for a lot of the participants was not a familiar space. And that was kind of one of the starting points after the jam of the research project, was this feeling that a lot of people express, a lot of people who are newcomers to the city, newcomers from other countries, people of color, this kind of feeling, and these are quotes from different interview participants that express, not being able to access space, whether it's physical barriers, like, for example, the Rat Creek is one of the only entrance points into the river valley from the inner city. And then there's a participant here who talks about those psychological barriers and not feeling welcome within those spaces. So we wanted to look at belonging. That was one of our main questions. And then the second participant here was a Métis person, speaking about how some of those connections to land have been fragmented over time, and specifically how having access to shape and use space is a way to reclaim some of those. So thinking about kind of that starting point, we looked at two questions. These are our research questions. This is as academic as I'll get today. So we just looked at, the first question, how can this participation in sort of food systems work support feelings of belonging within green space and then within the city as a whole? And how our work within those spaces can also help to reimagine those spaces, those communities, agriculture and food systems within the city, and kind of moving towards a more collaborative and inclusive model. So our findings for the first section there, and I want to use the words of the other researchers as possible. So there was, first of all, this idea of relationality to land and how that really brings about a sense of belonging, much more so than just kind of being in space and not knowing exactly, do you belong there? What can you do there? What are other people doing there? And so on. So the one participant talks about feeling that things were not as foreign once we were gathering berries together. And that being together was also something that really created belonging within green space, because sometimes it's a bit daunting as a newcomer, thinking about that person on the train, looking at the river valley from the first quote, just feeling, what can I do there? How do I get there? How am I going to be greeted there? So working in a group was also seen as being very important. And then we see over here some berries, and I've put them here because of this second finding, which is about natural spaces being really good spaces for multi-centered belonging. And that means that when we connect with food, it connects us both to that local place where we've harvested it, but it also often connects us back to food memories from home or natural spaces from home or grandmothers, especially through recipes. So again, that genre of recipe really resonated there. And the one example that we really liked from the research were the high bush cranberries. Those were my great grandmother's favorite berries. So I had a recipe with them, and they're an interesting berry. They smell interesting, they taste interesting. And a lot of the participants found that they tasted really, really similar to tamarind. So then we made some tamarind-like recipes with them, and there were a lot of kind of story sharing and knowledge sharing that happened around that. And then our second finding was just around the importance of new uses within space, new users, and then new narratives of space. So kind of going beyond what is the dominant cultural idea of what nature is or how we experience and use nature. And so the couple of quotes here, we have somebody that really keyed in on, you know, the intersection of people's experiences and people's backgrounds and people's culture with the natural environment. And especially through that kind of gathering of food and creation of food, how that creates new ideas, new possibilities, new perspectives. And then my second quote is probably the favorite one from the entire research project, because it was a very sort of joyous expression where this lady has learned about different foods that she can gather. And it makes her feel like she belongs in the space almost in a subversive way, because she's like, well, everyone's walking their dogs. And I'm like this crazy woman filling pockets with berries. I'm so happy to have found this way that, you know, that I can connect within space. And then one of our really lovely outcomes that we had from the project as well is that we kind of created something new and something old at the same time, which was that we had a celebration within an urban agricultural space and also within the ravine space itself. We shared food, some of the berries we made a tea from, and we were also able to have a fiddler come into the ravine. So I'm just going to show you very quickly the fiddler as well. And if probably most of you know who Blake Desjardins is, who kind of just showed up and ended up doing some jigging. And it was a very, very interesting community moment that happened within a space where fiddle music is very culturally important.
I take a wrong picture, sorry. The next one I learned from our good Ukrainian friends.
I wanted you to hear the nod to the Ukrainian steps in the jig, because I think that's really interesting how cultures connect as well through food and dance and so on. So, oops, without playing that again, our overall findings, what are our reasons to gather? Why do we do these types of things, creating community and gathering foods within wild spaces, green spaces? Because we're working on social inclusion, which means not just having people enter the river valley or having people be in gardens, but having that freedom to partially define or to co-create the space and the knowledge and the community that happens there, in order that we might all, you know, feel more comfortable within those spaces and have a deep belonging to those spaces. And in that way, we create that kind of reciprocity and respect for land. And then the second one is building an equitable future. So questioning the dominance of kind of this univocal idea of nature and stewardship, and then confronting those histories of exclusion within food systems and green space. And what we found is that there's a need for a greater and more open engagement, which includes different sectors of society, right? And that's about it. So thank you from myself, and there's a thank you from all of the participants here as well. If you're interested in the book at all, it's at Audrey's Books, and all the gross go back into the Multicultural Family Resource Society. And we really want people to access it and read it and find out about what we did. That's kind of the point of the project, is to share our perspectives and our stories. So we do also have a free online version available for everyone to access as well. And just a quick shout out to our artist Sulima Acuna, who did all of the pencil crayon sketches, which also appear in the book. Thanks so much.
Oh my gosh, Sarah, what a beautiful presentation. Thank you so much. And as you were showing that one photo of you, and you said that your mom was in the background making the choke cherry jelly, I had to run to my cupboard because this is choke cherry jelly from my mom. And my cupboard always has choke cherry jelly from my mom in it. So yeah, awesome. Thank you so much. And I'm glad to know who did the pencil drawings as well. They're lovely. All right, well, thank you so much. And our next speaker is Cathrine Shier. Cathrine is a professional biologist who works to conserve Edmonton's wildlife and wild places in her various roles with the City of Edmonton. Cathrine has a Master's of Science in Environmental Biology and Ecology from the University of Alberta, and has led the city's ecological mapping, wildlife passage, and biodiversity monitoring work as an ecological planner. As Edmonton's first conservation coordinator, and congratulations again on your new job, Cathrine is working to continue and expand upon the wildlife conservation work being led by the Edmonton Valley Zoo. Cathrine will be speaking about the important role the North Saskatchewan River Valley has as a wildlife corridor and how Edmonton works to protect it. She'll be sharing images from one of her favorite projects, Wild Edmonton, a joint wildlife monitoring project between the City of Edmonton and the University of Alberta. Over to you, Cathrine.
Wonderful. Can everybody see the presentation and hear me?
Yes.
Yep. Perfect. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate this opportunity to share some of the things that the City of Edmonton has learned about how wildlife use our river valley. And the three speakers, we have just met each other today, and I am amazed at the how Sarah had mentioned that the social connections to the land have been fragmented. And you'll notice that the title of my talk is Maintaining Wildlife Connectivity in an Increasingly Fragmented World. And it's interesting, when you fragment the land, what are the implications socially and environmentally? My second slide, before I change to it, I want to make sure that everybody knows it is not the City of Edmonton's, but it is an amazing figure that I took from Dark Horse Analytics. So I need to give, they are an amazing group of people here in Edmonton that actually use a lot of data from the City of Edmonton that we post on open data, and they do a number of visualizations. So I was trying to find a way to, how do we conceptualize fragmentation? And so this is how Edmonton has developed since we have records back in 1917. And so the Edmonton was founded in 1903. We, of course, were people were living in the area way before that. But this idea of fragmentation, and we are an urban center, and that does cause a difficulty around balance of what we can do for the environment and what we can do even for our social health. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the things that we've been doing at the city to try to understand ecologically and environmentally, are there ways that we can maintain or mitigate for fragmentation, even in an urban area? So despite that fragmentation that we've seen over the last 100 years, Edmonton is still very blessed with a great green network, especially for an urban center. Most well known, and what we're here to talk about tonight, is the River Valley, often as North America's largest contiguous green space, with its 22 ravines that connect into it, and at some points it's as large as 1.6 kilometers wide, which is quite impressive. Connected into that and around that is the protection of close to 5,000 hectares of natural areas now. These are spaces dedicated to nature conservation. And in addition to that, there's another 11,000 hectares of open space, with whether or not it's semi-natural, which is our school sites that are well vegetated, or even our sports fields or boulevards, areas where people can enjoy and connect with native vegetation. Now, Edmonton is actually in a very unique place in Alberta. We are in what's called the Central Parkland, and that means we're at the intersection of the boreal forest to the north and the prairies to the south. And what that means is we're actually a very biodiverse area. We're a biodiversity hotspot for fish. We have lake sturgeon in our rivers. They are an endangered critter, and we look to waste. So we have to understand, I'm going to be talking mostly about the land, but we also have to think about the river itself. We have 47 species of mammals, forest sensitive or at risk, and close to 200 species of birds, 32 of them being sensitive and at risk. And these areas that we've protected in this major urban center help support that. And so one critter that was not actually on this list of 47 species, so now we can actually say 48 species, is this guy that we found out when we started our wildlife monitoring program that I'll tell you a little bit about. And so I'm happy to share with you tonight some of our learnings. So since the city was founded in 1903, but our first River Valley Park that was protected was in 1913, and it was Victoria Park. It was pretty much a denuded, muddy hill, but if anybody who sees it now, it's been revegetated. But really, natural area protection had a major paradigm change in 2007. And natural area protection and the way we think about our natural area network really took off. And so prior to this time, our strategy was kind of protecting what we can get. But with the council adoption of Natural Connection Strategic Plan, we actually started to be more strategic and said, you know what, it's not just about protecting individual natural areas, it's about making sure they're connected. And so with this, you create a much stronger natural area system and a more climate resilient system. So that was in 2007. In 2010, we had a new municipal development plan. For those people who don't know, a municipal development plan is how the city commits to developing moving into the future. There were 9 strategic goals in it, and one of them was that Edmonton commits to protecting, preserving, and enhancing its natural environment by maintaining a functioning ecological network. This was at the same level as having a sustainable transportation system, having a sustainable financial network. And so obviously people know that the city plan has since replaced the way we green, but their council renewed its commitment to maintaining a functioning and interconnected ecological network for the next however many years the city plan is up and ready to however long council endorses it. Council has said, yes, this is a goal we are going to continue to maintain. And so in 2010, in order to implement that, we know that our ecological network is bisected. The river valley is bisected by roads. And so in order to help ecologists talk to transportation engineers, the city developed a wildlife passage engineering design guidelines, which helped engineers understand how to incorporate the needs of wildlife into our transportation networks. And so this was our most recent wildlife passage that's open. So from 2010, this project was probably 4 or 5 years in development, all the way from concept to design. That's the image of the design. When it was open in September 2019, this is what it looked like. And there was a reconstructed stream bed in there. There was wildlife passage for large mammals, medium mammals, and even small mammals were taken into account. They like to scurry through bushes, so there's a whole bunch of wood piles within this arch. And people have been asking me, actually, if you saw the picture of me in the announcement of this talk tonight, they were like, where were you standing? And I was standing here, and this is the crossing of Orem Road in Northeast Edmonton over Clover Bar Ravine. The reason why I love this photo so much is if you look in the top right-hand corner of the image, it says wildlife crossing now open. So when if people don't know, when these roads are built and developers want to get in and develop their land, they actually have to pay a large portion. They have to pay for the first 2 lanes of roads, which include these crossings. And so this developer had said, well, we're going to celebrate the wildlife crossing. It's not just about the road, it's about the wildlife crossing. And I didn't know that this sign would be put up. So that day I actually went and checked our wildlife camera that we put in that passage. And sure enough, I downloaded the images and I sent this picture to the developer. I said, your sign is working. They know now that they can walk through it. So now, however, these things are expensive. Wildlife passages are expensive, and we have to make sure that we know we're putting them in the right spot. And so in 2017 was the council adoption of Breathe, which is Edmonton's green network strategy, which incorporates our ecological network and how it interacts with our celebration and wellness networks. And within this, it said very clearly that we need to actually start monitoring wildlife use on the ground and movement and understanding how they use open spaces. And that's specifically to inform open space management and to help minimize barriers to reduce negative human and wildlife interactions. So whether or not that's on a road, avoiding wildlife collisions, or that's providing safe wildlife habitat for wildlife to continue to enjoy and move safely through the city. So the problem is Edmonton's really big. We're over 70,000 hectares. And we have limited funds, although we have amazing partners who joined in with us to set up a grid of wildlife cameras across the city. And so the goal of our project was basically to monitor wildlife use through the city. Specifically, we put cameras up at wildlife passages to make sure that they're working as intended. We also wanted to identify baseline natural areas. In 2009, the City Council dedicated funding to purchase some natural areas. And we wanted to make sure we purchase natural areas that are on the outskirts of town. We're monitoring them before development comes, because when development comes in 5 to 10 years, we'll have a good baseline for those natural areas. And we also wanted to study our corridors. Are our existing corridors working, particularly those ones that were developed in the early 1900s, when people weren't thinking about wildlife passage through our river valley. And all of this ideally is to inform better ecological network planning and to mitigate some of the effects of urban development on our wildlife and habitat systems. So like I said, Edmonton's big. So we had over 70,000 hectares to figure out where are we going to put our 60 cameras. Because at the time we started our project with 8 cameras. And so there is a lot of great remote information. And so that's information that we can capture through satellite or through aerial imagery. And so this is a picture of Southwest Edmonton as per the human eye. But what we're interested in knowing is, how do chickadees move through this area, or how do coyotes or other wildlife critters? So we have the University of Alberta in Edmonton, and they've done lots of great research on urban wildlife. And so, for example, if we wanted to get a bird's eye view of how chickadees use this area, we need to know how they like to move through this city. So we know that through research, they don't like to cross openings greater than 25 meters. Whether or not that's a road or an open field. They love forests that are dense. And all of these features we can lay together, and we could develop basically a resistance map for chickadees or coyotes. We've done this for a couple of species. And what you see here is the dark green areas represent those areas where it's easy for chickadees to move through. They'd be perfectly happy. Whereas the purple areas are actually those areas not where they don't go, but it's harder to get through them or less desirable. And so ultimately this can be viewed as a resistance map. Like the purple areas are higher resistance. It's unlikely that if chickadees had a preference, they'd like to go towards the green areas. And so using the terminology of resistance is actually, researchers have developed a circuitscape analysis, which uses electrical theory and Ohm's law to basically run a charge through your system. So if you want to see how a chickadee would move from Big Island to central Edmonton, run a charge and see how chickadees how they might prefer to move through the city. And so putting all of this information together, you can actually identify the electrical network of the city of Edmonton for predicted wildlife movement. And on this image where you can see the hotter areas, so the reds and the oranges, those are areas that are used a lot. And so now we have a greater understanding of where are we going to put our limited 60 cameras across the city. So with that, we developed a grid of cameras. All of these yellow dots are cameras that have run through a variety of different times over the last 3 years. We created a grid for Edmonton, and we divided us into 4 quadrants. We attempted to do 2 transects, one that followed the river valley, the other that followed actually more of an urban transect. So from northwest Edmonton down to south east Edmonton. So our step one is basically set up the cameras. It's a pretty simple process. Step two is go out and identify what are the characteristics of some of the sites that you're monitoring. And step three is go out and get the photos and then tag them. Yes, that is a cougar. And yes, we found him in Edmonton. And no, we didn't find him in the River Valley. That'll be a point that I bring up later. So people often ask me what's my favorite photo, and my favorite photo is this one. This is mother moose and her two, I was going to say cubs, but let's not say that, walking under a wildlife passage, the first ever moose built wildlife passage within Edmonton. And so this is one of my favorite photos because it's really the culmination of 15 years of implementing the ecological network approach for biodiversity conservation, 10 years of wildlife passage planning, 2 years of wildlife connectivity mapping, and we found this 3 months within the wildlife monitoring program. Now, the other thing is, when you have 60 cameras up, we also, within our 3 years of running Wild Edmonton, our wildlife monitoring program, we had 1.8 images that we had to sort through. So the results I'm going to show to you today are actually some of our first analyses that we've done with the data. But a big thank you goes out to University of Alberta volunteers and our City of Edmonton data geeks. We started processing some of these images a couple of years ago, and it took 405 volunteer hours to only get through a third of them. And so we had to engage the help of our Analytical Center of Excellence in the City of Edmonton, who created an artificial intelligence program to help clear out a number of the images that were non-animal related. And we also had funding from the Alberta Conservation Association, which was very helpful as well. So what did we see? We saw beautiful images like this guy right here. I'm not sure if anybody can see him, but let me show you. Here he is. He's one of our critters, one of the mammal critters that we identified. He is a least weasel, and he's the guy that goes white in winter. And so it was special images like this that really made all of that hours and hours of wildlife tagging really worth it. And so what did we find? And so, like I said, we're still starting to process some of this data, and it's a wealth of information, and we have just scratched the surface, but I want to share some stuff with you. So our idea was, our major hypothesis was, okay, we've got this grid of cameras across the city, and we had estimated that, well, we're most likely going to find more wildlife or greater species diversity in those areas that are less touched by urban centers. So we're thinking outside of Anthony Henday, we're going to see higher species diversity in some of our natural areas. And so this, just to walk you through this image, this is a map of Edmonton, obviously. The areas in dark green are our natural areas, and in blue are wetlands, or in light green are what we call modified vegetation. So those are like agricultural lands. It's vegetation that's been heavily influenced by humans. And then in the yellow, it's developed. It's pretty much mostly cement and buildings. But what you'll see here, so the circles in the larger red circles are those sites where we've had over 11 mammal species identified. Then the orange circles are 6 to 10 mammal species, and then the yellow circles are less than 5 mammal species. So the pattern's kind of there. We have a lot of high diversity out on the outskirts, but also through the River Valley, we've got some high points. Now, the thing we have to remember, though, and working in the city, especially in the central part of the city, we ended up losing about 20 cameras over the 3 years. And so not all of our cameras ran for the same amount of time. And so you'd expect a camera that runs 3 years is more likely to find more critters than a camera that ran 6 months. So we basically standardized the data by dividing the number of species by the number of days the camera was up. And with that, you see a very interesting pattern that we're just starting to explore. And so while we have high species diversity, definitely on the outskirts of Edmonton, you'll see that the River Valley sites really pop up when you start to account for how long the cameras have been out. Now, us, this is something that we need to look into more. I didn't expect such a strong relationship so early, and this is another way to look at it. So this is on the x-axis, you have distance from the river. So you have the closest is on the left-hand side, and the furthest away from the river is on the right-hand side. And then on your y-axis, you have our normalized species. So that's the raw species count attempted to take into account for how long the cameras had gone. And these red dots are those high species per day sites, which are to the river. So we found, I was asked to show, like, how do you know that the river is important for wildlife connectivity? And it is a difficult thing to get into, and we are still digging through this data, but these are interesting results that we're really keen to explore more. We're also, in addition to the number of species that are found on the cameras, we also have the number of visits each critter has given to, or each species has attended. So, you might have the identification of a white-tailed deer, but some sites might have a lot of visits by a white-tailed deer versus fewer. And so obviously, the total number of those camera sites that have a large number of species identified are also those camera sites that have generally a lot of visitation. But these are results that we're digging into. The interesting thing is if you just look at the raw visitation data, so you'll see which are our most active sites. So again, the big orange dot or big red dots. When we actually divide that into the number of trapping days that we've had, so basically how long the cameras have run, we're not seeing as much of a pattern. And so we're still digging into this information. But where I like to go with this is, I know we're talking about River Valley, but we can't forget those natural areas, those amazing natural areas we have that are outside of the River Valley. And are they not important as source areas for our wildlife and important refugia in an area full of urban development? And so really go out and appreciate your neighborhood natural area, because they're just as important when it comes to wildlife visitation as our River Valley sites. So we've got some other things we're looking into. We're looking into density of roads. So density of roads is we take a buffer around each site and we say, okay, in that 100-meter buffer, how many roads are in there? What's the density of roads? And so we're starting to see that obviously lower density, lower amount of roads, that's where we're seeing our high diversity of sites. And so we're just starting to explore these other areas we're looking into. We've got trail density. This data, because we've been working with the Urban Wildlife Information Network, this data is now being used in 11 peer-reviewed papers. And on our end, we are really looking into, and so we've done multi-city from across the North America. One study that was recently published actually compared wealth, and which is a more important driver for wildlife diversity. Is it wealth or is it a landscape characteristics? And cities like Chicago, who have this gentrification, the serious gentrification, where you have the wealthy areas of this city have high species diversity because they've got a lot of the beautiful green areas. Well, that wasn't what was shown in Edmonton. Edmonton, it was all landscape driven, because I think we've been doing a good job on this ecological network. And so now we're just digging into these to figure out what makes a great biodiverse park in Edmonton. And with that can inform better ecological planning and even restoration throughout our river valley. But, despite all of these graphs and maps and science, what I often really like are the anecdotes. My favorite anecdote as to whether or not our ecological network is moving is, I don't know if people remember, but in 2019, this guy, they said wayward wapiti. The Edmonton Journal had an article that said elk on the run in Edmonton. Well, this guy was actually found up in Northeast Edmonton on July 19th. We had our cameras running, so we rushed up there and we got our cameras because we wanted to see, was he going through the river valley? We didn't find him on our camera sites until we started looking at our southwest sites. Now, is it the same elk? I am going to put myself out on a limb and say, yes, it was, because how many elk are running through Edmonton and being on the north side of the river? And so within a couple of weeks, we spotted him on our cameras in the southwest. And so, even if we don't have the science quite figured out, I'd like to think that some of these anecdotes that we're learning about actually help prove the point that the river valley is very important for wildlife connectivity. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for supporting River Valley Conservation through attending. And I'm excited to answer any questions you might have later on. This is a GIF, which is a series of photos I've put together. And this is, you can tell the white-tailed deer is flagging because he happens to notice that a coyote's walking behind him. It all ended well. They separated ways and they're perfectly happy. But this is smack dab in, this is in Graydon Hill.
Wow, I was wondering what was going on there. Thank you so much, Cathrine. And I have to ask, are you the one who spotted the least weasel first in that other photo? I can't believe somebody saw that and they didn't just click right through.
We have amazing volunteers who have keen eyes. And this photo also is from our wildlife camera program.
Wow. All right. Well, thank you so much for that excellent talk. And we'll have questions for you and Sarah at the end. Before we move on to our final speaker, I'm just going to hand things over to Rocky Farrow for the live auction of shovelfuls of native plants from Rocky's garden.
All right, I'm ready. If Chris is ready, maybe he can scroll the live auction visuals. If anybody wants to get this over super quick, maybe just call out $500 right now, and the first auction item is yours. Chris, can you unmute people? Because what we're going to do here is have people unmute their mics, state their name, and state their bid. I'll write it down. So watch your screen, but listen to my voice. I want this live auction to be short and fruitful. We've already raised over 600 thanks to generous ticket donors, and I'd like to get that over 1,000. So unmute your mic and call out. Go on, try it now.
Everybody should be able to unmute as needed now.
If you're real shy, you can put it in the chat, and I'll ask my colleagues to record. So can I get 100? That's the minimum bid here.
I see 100, Rocky, in the chat from Annam.
Okay, can you hear that for me, Christine?
Yep, got it.
Now, this is priceless nature. That's what we're bidding on. And by all rights, these endangered native plants shouldn't be for sale. But ladies and gentlemen, unmute, bid, repeat. So what do I have? I've got 100 now. Do I hear 150?
We've got 110 from Cheryl and then 130 from Linda Duncan.
All right, I've got 130. Do I hear 150? You will roam the nursery to meet and select over 30 native plants. You'll go home with more than a car full. Perfect for rewilding, perfect for...
Annam has bid 150.
All right, we've got 150. What are you gonna give me? You're gonna give me 200. Do I hear 200? Don't hesitate, participate. Nature calls us in many ways. Maybe you're using this time for the bathroom break, that's okay. But if you snooze, you lose, and I'm gonna cut this off momentarily. So get your bid in.
160 from Janet. Mary Ellen bids 175.
All right, we got 175. Do I hear 180? We've got 175. Who's gonna give me 180? Come on, the water's warm. Let's make it hot.
200.
200. We've got 200. All right, we've got 200. Who's
Mildred.
Mildred Thrills got 200. Thank you, Mildred Thrill. Mildred Thrill has 200. Save these endangered species. Don't hesitate. Participate. At least 10 shovels of mature native plants. And we don't specify the shovel size. So who's going to give me 250? Do I hear?
Bidding 210.
210, we've got 210. Who's gonna give me 220? Mother Nature has built these plants to survive Alberta's winters and dry summers. They'll be the envy of every monarch butterfly in town. We've got little blue violets, we've got rare crowfoot violet, we've got giant hyssop, we've got many native species. Who's gonna give me 220?
Mary Ellen is bidding 220.
All right, we've got 220. Who's gonna give me 230? We've got 220. Who's gonna give me 230? Thank you, Mary Ellen, for 220. Who's gonna give me 230? All right, 220 going. 220 going. 220.
Oh, 230. Annam just got in. a
All right.
bid At the last minute.
And
And Mary
jumping
Ellen says, darn you.
I don't want to make people anxious here, but Anna made it just under the wire. So you snooze, you lose. Who's going to give me 240? 230 going, 230 going, 230 gone to Anna. Anna, you were the winner at 230. Thank you very much. That helps with our fragmented river valley. We really appreciate it. Now, that's one auction item gone. We can go, who had the 220 bid?
That was Mary Ellen.
All right, Mary Ellen, do you still want to go for 220? Does anybody want to stop Mary Ellen? Mary Ellen's got 220. Mary Ellen has 220. Who wants to give me 230? Come on, don't hesitate. We're going to close this off soon. 220 going once. 220 going twice. Mary Ellen?
And she says, yes, please.
All right, Mary Ellen, you are the winner at 220. Thank you very much, everybody. Let's get on with our third speaker. Make sure that you put your full name. Christine, are you confident you've got people's names?
I think Corey has said he will get the email addresses from Annam and Mary Ellen. So Annam and Mary Ellen, please make sure that you touch base with Corey DeGroot before the end of the event tonight, so that you can get your wonderful plants. And Rocky, thank you so much for that excellent and entertaining live auction. And all the slides, and for the generosity of donating plants from your garden.
Yeah, they're very generous donors tonight. We're over $1,000 from this event.
Wonderful.
So thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you, Mary Ellen. Thank you, Annam. Yeah, that's what helps to keep us going. This is our one fundraiser for the year, and that really helps us a lot. So thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. All right, so I guess, Chris, we can turn off everyone's mics again until the end when we come back for Q&A, and we will move on to our third speaker. And I think, let's see. Here we go. So we are over to you, Carolyn. So Carolyn Nutter was born and raised in Ontario. She met her husband, Butch, while they were both students at Queen's University, and they married in 1963. After a couple of years in California, they moved to Edmonton to attend graduate school in 1965. In 1968, after the birth of their first child, they bought a house a half a block from Millcreek Ravine. Shortly after they moved in, they realized their entire block would be wiped out to make way for a freeway through the ravine. So with some neighbors, they set out to disrupt those plans. I love that. Carolyn still lives in Edmonton, though has moved to Garneau. Her daughter and her family, however, still live in the house by the ravine. Carolyn's talk will outline the Met's plan and the neighborhood efforts to defeat it. She will also talk about the efforts of Millcreek Build a Park to keep the ravine in its natural state. Carolyn, over to you.
Oops. Okay, technical. Oh, shoot. How do I get back to my Zoom meeting?
Well, we can see you if you're, don't panic, because we can always run your PDF for you.
Well, I'm just, I don't
Can you
know.
think about how you did it before?
It's okay. No, it's not. I'm still hooked up, am I?
Yeah, we can still see you. So before, I'm not sure what you did before that you let you find the Zoom meeting again.
Sure either.
Can you just minimize the, you got it?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Screen. Okay,
Yay, we can see it. Perfect.
okay, good.
We're all set.
I'm afraid I don't have as many beautiful pictures as the other presenters did, but I'm just talking about our experience when they were planning to put a freeway through the Millcreek. It was really more than just the Millcreek. I'll show you, this is the map of what they were proposing. All of these blue lines are freeways. They include River Road, would now be a multi-lane freeway. And they include the Millcreek Ravine here, the McKinnon Ravine here. I'm not sure what all this north part is, but it was probably trying to use space that would be less expensive than developed space. But they were still going to have to expropriate a lot of properties, including ours, alongside the Millcreek Ravine. So when we moved to our place in 1968, we very quickly learned about the freeway plan and got busy and mobilized our neighbors and said, we don't want this to happen. Unfortunately, I can't tell you who all was involved because it was 50 years ago and I don't remember. But, you know, Butch and I get a lot of the credit for this, but there were many, many people involved in working on the lobbying city council and such. One of the first things we did was we actually did a survey, and we surveyed 1 in every 10 households and found that all but 3 of the people we talked to were opposed to the freeway plan and were willing to sign a declaration to that effect. Those that weren't opposed, one was a renter who said, well, I'll just move. And the other worked for a company that did business with the city, and he was afraid there would be retaliation. So that was our first step. And then we spoke to aldermen and we arranged 2 public meetings, one at King Edward School, which is west of the ravine, and another at the Rutherford School, east of the ravine. And they were hundreds of people came to each. And there were many of the aldermen were there. That's what they were called back then. They weren't called councillors. And we talked to them, and we tried to convince them that they did not want to vote for this plan. There was also a parallel process going on along the McKinnon Ravine. There was a group there that was opposing it. We didn't actually coordinate with them, and I'm not sure why. I think if I were doing it today, I probably would have suggested we do that. In any case, in 1971, the Met's plan came up to council for approval. We presented to council, and I think in part because of the relationships we'd established through the public meetings, we narrowly won the vote. The vote was 7-6 against the freeway plan. One of the people that voted against it was Cease Purvis, who later became mayor. And I don't think he would have without the the work that we had done. And then in 1975, Millcreek Park was finally officially designated, which was a great relief to all of us. But then there was the question of what was going to happen to the ravine. Now, there was not going to be a freeway. The city's vision would have involved a major disruption of the ravine's natural character. They had hired a landscape architect, Butler Krebs, and they came up with a plan that had lovely landscaping, little waterfalls along the creek. And then there were a lot of recreational facilities that would have intruded on the natural character of the ravine. And City Council considered adopting a top of the bank policy, which would have meant any private property below the top of the bank would be expropriated. We opposed that in part because some of our neighbors lived under the top of the bank and they've been very active in trying to preserve the ravine. It didn't seem reasonable to kick them out. And partly because we thought having some eyes on the ravine made it a safer place for people to, for kids and other folks. Because our vision was to leave it in its natural state with only some improvements to the trail system. We formed a society, the Millcreek Build-A-Park Society, to negotiate with the city, and they did listen to us some of the time. But one day I got a call from a neighbor who lived down below the top of the bank, and she said, "There's a bulldozer here." And we hadn't heard about a bulldozer coming to do some work in the park. So I said, "Okay, I'll meet you there, grab your kids." So she and I both took our kids down and stood in front of the bulldozer. We were pretty sure they wouldn't run over us. And just to give you an idea, interestingly, this painting I have was given to my husband and I on our 25th anniversary by some neighbors. It was commissioned. And the artist said, "Well, where do you want?" They wanted a painting of the Millcreek Ravine. And they said, "Where do you want me to paint?" And she said, "Why don't you just choose a place?" And this is the cut bank that they were going to bulldoze. So he didn't know that, but that's where he chose to paint it, because they were coming in what they want. They thought this was dangerous. The creek used to run along underneath it. It doesn't anymore. What they did instead was reroute the creek. But that cut bank is still there, and our kids are still alive. The other thing that happened, but then when they started building the trail system, they wanted to bridge the creek in various places. And I can still remember they were building a bridge at a spot where, down near the north end of the ravine. And one of the local people who'd been involved in Millcreek Build-A-Park and had lived there for many years said to them, "That's not a good place to build the bridge. It'll be washed out." "Oh, no, it's fine." Well, sure enough, in the spring, that bridge disappeared. And they, so our negotiations weren't all that intense, but we were present enough that they scrapped the Butler Krebs plan and agreed that just an improvement to the trail system. As you know, today there's an extensive trail system through the ravine. The main trail is the old Yukon right-of-way. And as you all know, just because the ravine is still there, we need to stay vigilant for the whole River Valley system. Not that many years ago, there was another proposal to kind of run a major road down 103rd Street and through Queen Elizabeth Park. And that also did not go anywhere. So I think the presentations we've seen today show how important it was to what's the word I'm looking for? To save the river valley system, because it would have been full of freeways had the transportation planners had their way. What they did instead of all the freeways was, that's why 104th Street is one way going south, 103rd Street is one way going north, and the High Level Bridge and the Walterdale Bridge are one-way bridges now. That was called Project Uni, and there was a transportation planner in the city who came up with it. I unfortunately can't remember his name, but that seemed a better solution to getting people downtown than building major freeways. We had been in California just before we moved to Edmonton, and we had seen what happened with freeways. The Embarcadero Freeway, for example, was built in San Francisco in that 19, and it stopped in midair. They decided they didn't really want to do that, and they eventually demolished it. So it was good that we had that experience, probably. But anyway, I think this is better than a freeway. Anyway, that's all. It's not a lot of detail because I honestly don't remember the details, but it was, I think, an important action to take, and we're very pleased that the ravine and the river valley are still relatively intact. But it, they could. I'm glad that things are happening that will probably make it very difficult for the city to reinstate road plans like that. And I just want to comment on berries. My husband and I used to go every fall, usually down below the old provincial museum, but other places as well, and harvest chokecherries. And he made chokecherry syrup, which we had on our pancakes for the rest of the year. So anyway, that's it. I know it was
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Carolyn. And yeah, there are a lot of thank yous coming in on the chat, which is still open. And I want to say thank you as well. I mean, it's just, we owe so much to those of you who fought to save Millcreek Ravine and McKinnon Ravine and basically the whole river valley. And I feel that responsibility now. I think all of us who are volunteering with ERVCC do, to carry a torch. I mean, it's important for every generation to remain vigilant, as you say. And I love that your kids then, had a story that they could tell their friends, or maybe classmates about helping to stop a bulldozer. So wonderful. Thank you so much. And yeah, I mean, this map is just crazy. What a nightmare. Hey,
well, it wouldn't, the city would be so different if they'd gone ahead with this. So
yeah, it absolutely would. All right, well, thank you so much. So maybe, Chris, if we can go back to seeing all the speakers, and then I have a few questions that have come in already. If others have questions for any of the speakers, please put them into the chat now, and we'll go over to those. But I have received a few. So the first question I'll ask is for Sarah. And it's, how do you navigate the parkland bylaw, which I believe says that you can't pick berries in the river valley or pick anything from the river valley, and how would you like to see it reformed?
That's a great question. Thanks for the question. And clearly we can all see that it's a very Edmonton thing to do, to pick chokecherries. But so actually the city policy, as far as I understand, does allow us to pick berries. The issue comes up when we're picking other parts of plants. And so, for example, we are not supposed to be picking branches. We're not supposed to be picking plants. So things that I would pick, this is being recorded, right? Things that I would pick would be, for example, strawberry leaves for tea, bark, things like that. We're not really supposed to be picking. And this was actually really central to the work that I was doing at the Métis Nation of Alberta with the environment team there. Just around, why that bylaw is in place, and how sort of effective it is, or how necessary it is to protect spaces and plants and things like that. And I did make some headway with the city. Originally, I kind of sent an email and they said, yep, no, don't do that. And then I sort of said, well, you know what, it's very culturally important for Métis people, for Indigenous people, for other people to harvest some of those things. And we do have a pretty strong commitment here in Edmonton to reconciliation and to acknowledging land and whatnot. And so the Indigenous Relations Office did get back to me and say, actually, it's okay. The bylaw is there still, and I would very much like to see that changed. And it is also something that's not consistent across municipalities. So for example, St. Albert is quite supportive of harvesting. And I think some of that has to do with the large Métis presence there. I'm just assuming, but they're quite supportive of it. Some other places, and I can't remember right now, there is a report that you can read if you're interested. But some of the other municipalities actually say no. Some of them say you have to apply for a certain kind of license. You have to show some sort of ID and whatnot. So I think the bylaw is not strongly enforced in terms of harvesting small amounts of things, which would be what we would support as Métis people anyways, that kind of respectful harvesting, the sort of 10% rule, making sure it's kind of a reciprocal, there's a duty of care there. And so I think the policy is there to kind of avoid major disruptive situations. And I do think that the city is kind of working toward more openness to this kind of cultural use and even just, food systems use around the city.
Excellent. And maybe, that's why it's so important, as you noted before, the gathering has two terms for you, or two meanings for you. It is about bringing people together as well as collecting foods, and in that way, then there's an opportunity for learning about honorable harvest as well, which I think that's so wonderful. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. All right. The next question that I've got is for Cathrine. And I can't remember what the distance was that you had noted that chickadees will not travel. Was it 25 meters?
It's not travel, it's they prefer the amount of times that they cross is 25 meters. Yeah, so the number of times that they cross a gap that's greater than 25 meters significantly declines. And so, yeah.
Okay, so this question was an interesting one. Do chickadees cross the river, or are there north and south chickadees?
Oh, that's an awesome question. I have no doubt they can cross larger passage than 25 meters, but do they find ways around it? We don't know, actually. And so again, it's not that they don't cross, just like a lot of the areas in the circuitscape that are black, it's not that they're not there, it's just not their preferred way to go. And so, but yeah, like we know in highway studies, different populations or genetics of grizzly bears on different sides of the highway, naturally maybe there is that diversity in songbirds that don't like to go in open areas. But then we have then we have our grassland species that are perfectly happy with passing larger openings. So
All right, I love Sarah's point in the chat. I want a Northside Chickadee t-shirt. Me too. Whoever makes those, let us know. I think that could be another auction item for the future. All right, thank you so much, Cathrine. And I'll come back around again. But a question for Carolyn. What were the trails like in Millcreek Ravine before the Metz plan was proposed, and how has the ravine changed in the last 50 years, would you say?
You're muted, Carolyn.
Okay, now can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. The railroad right of way has always been there, although I think it may have been improved. There was also a road going across the ravine. It was called the Vogel Hill Road. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that. But where that cut bank is, in fact, there used to be a road that went all the way through the ravine from the west side to the east side. That has since been closed. And the trails were basically trails that had been made by people wandering through the bush, the other trails. And so, you know, they weren't improved in the way they are today. So I think it's an improvement because now there are trails for people to walk on, so they're not as likely to be wandering off into the bush and disturbing the vegetation and the wildlife. The right-of-way main trail from north to south is fabulous for old folks who like to bike. My husband and I used to go out and bicycle along because it's a very gradual grade all the way, as railways are. And so I think it's easier to kind of wander through the ravine now because there are actual trails. So.
Okay. All right, thank you. I mean, I think that was a good question because it is hard to know. You know, we just sort of take for granted the way a place looks today, without really thinking about what it might have looked like even, you know, a few decades ago. So,
well, of course, there was also the Gainers plant was there, which was not a very pleasant thing to pass because it stunk a little bit. So it's not there anymore. So there, I mean, the ravine did have a lot of industrial development in it at one point, of various kinds, but that was long before we got involved with it, except for Gainers. Gainers was still there.
Yeah, I even remember that as a kid when my family would ride our bikes through Creek. I still remember seeing the Gainers plant too, and it was very creepy. So that was definitely an improvement to get that out of there for sure. All right, well, thank you. Back to Sarah. All right, this is a bit of a hot topic, a controversial one. So-called invasive species are a hot topic in the city, and the term is unfortunately sometimes even applied to species like coyotes and beavers that are most definitely not invasive. Rat Creek is an area where there are some introduced species like European buckthorn that have appeared over the past few years, and that one seems to grow pretty quickly. How do you think we should approach plants like this one in a way that does not jump into colonial thinking and recognizes that so-called weeds are often undertaking important remediation, but also doesn't miss acting if we should?
Yeah, so I'm going to have to first of all say that I have zero science background. So getting into particular species and what the impacts of that species will be over time and how much is too much and when do we need to, you know, I've done some reading on invasive species and what the mitigation efforts are like. And from the AT perspective, there were a lot of pesticide issues around, you know, the removal of some of those species. But I think sort of what I can say about this issue is that absolutely there are so many introduced species there, and depending on what kind of sort of ecosystem damage they're responsible for, I think there are so many of those plants that are fairly integral to food and medicine systems at this point. If you do get a chance to take a look at the recipe book online, or if you have a copy of it, we do a recipe with caragana blossoms, for example. And they're delicious and they taste just like pea shoots. And for anyone who's on a budget, pea shoots are really expensive in grocery stores, and they're much prettier, the caragana flowers, because they're bright yellow, and they're everywhere in the city. And it's my understanding that they were brought in, I think they're originally from Siberia, and those were used as kind of wind shields. We find those in rural areas as well. And they're just kind of everywhere now because they're super hardy, and they grow well. And so I know that I think the mountain ash is also an introduced species. I mean, I think most of the Canard Ravine is kind of a lot of species that have maybe not been there, forever. But, and especially, speaking from my perspective and from a kind of a Métis perspective, we use so many European plants. I know plantain, for those of you who have read the Braiding Sweetgrass book, there's a lot in there about plantain and dandelions. This is a hot topic always. And we have some dandelion recipes in the book as well. So I think, there's a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different input that people from different groups will give. But from our perspective, we didn't discriminate between what is kind of an actually a native plant and how far back do we go and whatnot. And it's sort of, we related that relationship actually to beadwork in a way, because again, from a Métis perspective, we're known sort of for being the flower beadwork people. And that's really combining a lot of beadworking techniques, which were geometric most of the time when we saw them originally, and then using these botanical patterns from Europeans. And so I think, the combination of many different types of plants is unavoidable at this point. And I'm happy to use many of them and to enjoy many of them. But again, I'm not an expert on mitigation and whatnot.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. I make a dandelion pesto every year. I'm so excited. I'm very careful to pick the dandelion leaves so that I don't harm the plant, so that they'll keep coming back and I can make that pesto every year. And I see Mildred has said dandelions are one plant that every farm animal will eat. Cathrine, I saw your hand up. Did you want to say something about this?
Yeah, if I could, when I first started with the city and being more of an ecology background and a little bit of a purist in terms of natural areas being natural, I talked to a professor at the university just to get their idea on biodiversity and how to protect biodiversity. He said, well, cities are the most biodiverse flora in terms of flora than any other area. And I think it's when we talk about things like and I think it is part of the diversity of the city. But when it comes to the River Valley and it comes to areas where we want to prioritize wildlife habitat, birds use caragana. However, caragana is a climax species, and it shades out everything else underneath, and it only allows itself to grow. And so in those areas of the River Valley where we want to increase biodiversity or increase habitat type, we do need to start thinking about appropriate use of species, especially nowadays when we know a little bit more. And so you'll often find that in the old neighborhoods along top of bank, they would plant the ash and the elm and all of those. But in our newer neighborhoods, we actually go for native species, because we don't, the maple is a beautiful tree. It also shades out everything underneath it and only allows itself to grow. And so in areas close to our natural areas and river valleys, we try to avoid those species now, because they can become quite invasive in a sense of removing. Like somebody was mentioning that if you remove the caragana and the ash and the oak from Millcreek, you'd lose half the biomass. Yes, that's exactly the problem with some of these species when it comes to our natural areas. And that's what we need to avoid moving into the future. Appreciating this for everything in its place, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, it is such a tricky question, isn't it? Thinking about how, some of these species that are introduced are performing sort of like they've got their own gifts and are sometimes, like I said, doing some kind of remediation work as well. And it does make it all quite tricky. Yeah, I saw in Toronto, there was actually a protest. This is bringing in the advocacy again that we've been tonight against removal of a bunch of Manitoba maples in a ravine because it would have basically emptied out the ravine. So it is interesting. It seems like cities are all sort of dealing with these issues. Cathrine, there was a question from Linda regarding natural areas, and it's up in the chat somewhere, but it was along the lines of you've talked a lot about a lot of important natural areas in the tablelands, yet less than 1% is actually slated to be zoned natural area. Can you just comment on that?
Yeah, I kind of saw that in the comments, and so I mentioned 2007, which is that major paradigm shift. So it was in 2007 that we also got our natural area zone. So nowadays, when a tableland natural area comes in, it is zoned natural area. But the vast majority of our natural areas, our tableland natural areas in particular, came in prior to 2007. And that's why we have a citywide natural area management plan that attempts to cover those areas. Wherever there's the opportunity, I'm always arguing we should zone those natural areas because sometimes people don't realize that they're natural areas and other things happen within them. I hope that kind of got to your question, but I can confirm that every tableland natural area that now comes into the city's inventory is zoned natural area if it's on the tableland. River Valley does have its own zoning. But yeah, tableland natural areas are the most endangered, and they are hard to protect because the provincial government only municipalities the authority to protect things that are prone to flooding, prone to fall down a slope, so that's geologically unstable, and something for pollution prevention of water body. And so if you look at our tableland forests, which are very stable, they don't flood, and they don't have a water body to protect. The only way that we can do that is acquire it through municipal reserve, and municipal reserve, for those people who don't know about it, is also the designation that we use to bring in school sites into the city. And so is it protect a natural area or educate your children? There's this awful tension that has been created because of provincial legislation. And so that's why I mentioned some of the natural areas that we're studying are those natural areas that council actually dedicated money to purchase because municipalities have no other tools to protect tableland natural areas. And that's why I put a little reminder in that tableland natural areas need a little bit more help as well, because the River Valley, prone to flooding, steep slopes, has a water body to protect with a pollution buffer. It's easier for us to argue for the protection of things below top of bank. It is really hard for us to protect things above it.
I think maybe in those designated school sites, you just turn them into forest schools, and then you are protecting the land and educating the children together.
I just saw Linda's, my question was about natural area protection in the valley, not the tablelands. Okay, so this is another excellent question. And I think it is just the historical planning that historically, because the River Valley has its own zone, there was always the argument of, well, we'll just protect it as an A zone. And that's supposed to, encapsulate environmental protection, but also recreation, but also whatever. But it is something that the Ribbon of Green is now trying to resolve, working within that zone to say there's preservation areas, conservation areas, and intensive use. But there are natural areas within the River Valley. And I have always argued that special places like Tufa Springs, big island, a woodbend, there can be an argument to include those as natural areas, which would trigger the need for a natural area management plan and these types of items. But there has been historically, natural areas within the River Valley are never zoned NA. And I've never really quite understood why.
All right, well, we'll ask that question in our meetings with the city regarding the Ribbon of Green work that's being done. I guess one last question. I see that there are others coming in, but we're already at 8:34, but I just want to give, one last chance to Carolyn to inspire all of us, I suppose, who are doing River Valley advocacy, and just I mean, we are losing right now River Valley land, and due to a lot of infrastructure projects, as I mentioned earlier on. Do you have any words of advice for those of us who are advocating right now?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't have a lot of wisdom because it was a long time ago. And one of the things I think that worked in our favor at that time, there was no ward system in Edmonton. So even though we were a local group, all of the aldermen had to listen to us. That's not true any longer. I think one of the things that's important to do is whenever you're advocating, particularly if you're advocating, try to draw people from various parts of the city so that each alderman thinks they have a stake in it. And of course, it's not just lobbying council, but it's also building coalitions, I think. We didn't do that as well as we should have, but you know, once the plan fell through, then you didn't have to worry specifically about the McKinnon Ravine anymore, for example. Although, as I say, there was a group, someone here mentioned Margaret Chappelle, who apparently led the McKinnon Ravine fight. But I guess it's just being vigilant. As I say, what they wanted to do with Millcreek Ravine was turn it into an amusement park almost, you know, and I think we're past that now, but you never know when these ideas will resurface.
I think you're right that we do need to remain vigilant. It's easy. I think these things can maybe sometimes go in cycles, right? If you have a group that stands up and manages to protect an area like the River Valley, then the next few generations maybe just breathe a sigh of relief and don't think they have to worry about it anymore. And I think we're in the place again right now, at least it feels like that, where we've got to push back again. So yeah, I just want to thank you so much for all of that work that you did. We all love spending time in Millcreek Ravine and elsewhere throughout the River Valley and seeing it in that natural state. Yeah, just so much gratitude for those of you who went before and saved it. So
it was in our own interest as well, since our house would have been
of course it always is. It's in all of our interests, right? All of ours. So thank you so much, Carolyn. That
more than just the Millcreek Ravine we're concerned about.
Right. Thank you again. Thank you, Cathrine. And thank you so much, Sarah. We'll be in touch with all of you afterwards. This was such a wonderful lineup of talks. I think everyone appreciated them so much. I know I did. And I also want to thank Rocky again for the generosity of giving plants from her garden, and just for spending so much time with those plants that they're happy to just keep giving of themselves too. I mean, honestly, Rocky's garden has it endlessly produces more and more plants that she just keeps on giving away. So thank you so much. Thank you to the successful bidders tonight. Thank you to Corey DeGroot for your help in setting everything up tonight. Thank you to Chris Smith from CPAWS for helping to host the meeting. And thank you to all of you who joined us tonight and spent this Wednesday evening in front of your computers again, learning about these different perspectives and insights into the River Valley. So thanks so much, everyone. Again, if you do want to donate to ERVCC, you can e-transfer to ervccinfo@gmail.com. And that's it. We'll see you in the River Valley. Thanks very much.